years ago the Kept Animals Bill was introduced. The UK Government made a commitment to improve animal welfare, and we in the SNP supported that. Now, 3 DEFRA Secretaries of State later, 3 Prime Ministers later, we are not one step forward. We are exactly where we were 3 years ago on banning foie gras imports, which the Minister noticeably didn't mention. We are exactly where we were 2 years ago on banning animal fur imports, which the Minister didn't mention. And we are exactly where we were 2 years ago on tackling illegal puppy and kitten smuggling. And that is why my SNP colleagues and I support the motion today for that bill, the measures in that bill to proceed. There was a lot, as the Minister has conceded, there was a lot of very important provisions in the original Kept Animals Bill. And the fact that it's been quietly dropped, and we are told that the Government will now take forward individual measures, which I now understand is to be private members' bills. I thought governments were elected to govern, apparently not. And we're meant to be convinced by that display. Why should we believe it? The Minister, ludicrously, despite her protestations, cannot tell us which measures, which provisions contained in the original bill will not be brought forward as an individual measure, since the bill, as originally presented, has been dropped. And I would really like for her to tell us what measures they will not proceed with. I would like her to tell us how the priority list will be decided, and I would like her to tell us how these measures that they are so keen to bring forward to this House by whatever circuitous route, I would like her to tell us when we will see these measures, and will we see anything presented before summer recess, and will we get through that priority list, such as it might be, before the next general election. We know that people right across the UK really care about animal welfare. All you have to do is give your inbox the most cursory of glances to see that. And the people who write to us and email us and contact us about this issue will be deeply concerned about the antics, because that's what they are, the antics of the Government today, twisting on its own line. The Government has blamed everyone else and has argued that this bill has been dropped due to the fact that the Kept Animals Bill became too broad in scope beyond what was originally intended. But the reality is that this Government is crumbling in the face of opposition from certain sections of its own backbenchers. The same kind of backbenchers who were vociferously opposed to a ban on importing foie gras and vociferously opposed to a ban on importing fur products, as highlighted most eloquently by the Honourable Member for North East Somerset. The reality is that the UK Government doesn't want to engage in a fight with its own backbenchers, despite the fact that these issues were in its own manifesto. The reality is that foie gras production and fur farms were banned in the UK because of the cruelty they inflicted on living creatures. But this Government is perfectly content to outsource cruelty, hypocritical in itself, in order to appease some sections of its own backbenchers. It is truly shameful, and the Government may wish to reflect on that. As we know this is the case, due to the very frank comments from the former DEFRA Secretary of State, the Right Honourable Member for Camborne and Redruth, who predicted in February that the animal welfare commitments in this very bill that has been dropped would be shelved. And it turns out he was right. And I think, Mr Deputy Speaker, it is worth reminding the House of what the former DEFRA Minister actually said. He said, and I quote, "The way we treat animals, in particular farmed animals, is a hallmark of a civilised society, and you should be constantly striving to do better." He says of the legislation that bans primates as pets, outlaws live exports and further regulates puppy farming. Officially, the Government, at the time when he said these remarks in February, officially the Government was still committed to the bill. But he said at the time that he was hearing mixed signals about whether or not, in fact, it would pass into law before the next election, which must be held by the end of next year. And he said, My sense is that they're putting less emphasis on animal welfare, which I think is a shame. And we know the measures proposed in this bill, of course, have huge public support. The annoying thing for me, he went on, would be if the Kit Animal Bill now also doesn't go ahead because of lack of resolve to take it through. And I note his words. Interestingly, he refers to a lack of resolve. And this is what we see today. The Minister can wriggle all she likes on the proverbial hook about individual measures and such like, but the fact is the Government's resolve, as set out by the former DEFRA Secretary of State, the Government's resolve to proceed with this bill has broken for fear it might upset some of its backbenchers who have fewer concerns about animal welfare than the people they purport to represent. And again, as for its so-called position of ditching this bill and introducing individual measures, where is the timetable? The Minister stood up and defended the fact that we're bringing forward various measures. No timetable, no detail, no priority list, nothing. Clearly, importing foie gras, importing animal fur and taking real efforts to tackle puppy smuggling is off the table. And what we are left with is the shattered remains of what was a perfectly decent and comprehensive bill. Now, this bill largely relates to England, but the elements of it which are UK-wide are extremely important and show where Scotland is being held back for animal welfare. The dropping of this bill also means that the plans to ban live exports for slaughter and fattening from or through the UK, where all the major parties supported it and which appeared in each of the manifestos in 2019, has also been dropped, a move described by the Compassion World Farming as an unacceptable backtracking on animal welfare commitments, allowing this trade to continue. But the dropping of this bill must be, and it gives me no pleasure to say this, Mr Deputy Speaker, the dropping of this bill must be a cause of celebration if you are a ruthless puppy or kitten smuggler, both very lucrative in their own right with insufficient deterrents to this barbaric practice. Dropping this bill must have been good news for those who import foie gras and animal fur products into the UK. And the dropping of this bill is indeed a very depressing day for those who genuinely care about animal welfare. And for all the fights that the UK Government likes to pick with the Scottish Government passed legislative consent for this bill. But it seems that even when the Scottish Government agrees with the UK Government then decides to disagree with itself. And what I find really distressing, Mr Deputy Speaker, is the way that in Scotland we have come so far on animal welfare, only to find that we are shackled to this dead hand of government who refuses to act because it's paralysed by its own internal divisions and making some progress. Meanwhile, Scotland, under the SNP, continues to be a beacon across the UK and indeed Europe on animal rights, with the Dogs Protection of Livestock Bill passed in the Scottish Parliament in 2021, the Hunting with Dogs Bill passed in the Scottish Parliament in January. In its programme for government, the SNP implemented the majority of recommendations on the Protection of Wild Mammals Act and further measures on preventing trail hunting. It is consulting on proposals to improve animal transport legislation and phase out cages for game birds and lane hens and farrowing crates for pigs. It is consulting on legislation to extend the framework for licensing of activities involving animals to new areas, such as performing animals and animal care services. It is considering whether the SSPCA should have extra legislative powers to investigate wildlife crime. It is reviewing the Dangerous Dog Act to inform future policy and legislative changes to tackle irresponsible dog ownership. Last year, it became a legal requirement for puppy, kitten and rabbit breeders to be licensed. There is ongoing work with the Animal Welfare Committee to examine issues around sheep castration and tail docking. This very week, Highland cats are being reintroduced to the wild, and work will be undertaken over the next 3 years to save the species from extinction. It is examining the use of acoustic deterrent devices in salmon farming, as well as the issue of e-collars. Mr Deputy Speaker, I could go on, but I fear I'm showing off now, because what I'm doing is I'm showing the contrast between two governments: a government that is ambitious, a government that is ambitious and progressive and keen, as a mark, as the former DEFRA Minister said, as a mark of how civilised Scotland is on these matters, while we have we're shackled to a corpse who will not act, who cannot act. I merely point out, Mr Deputy Speaker, that the dithering of this government, when it comes to delivering its own promises in the Kept Animals Bill, it doesn't even have the confidence to deliver its own manifesto commitment and the very bill it brought to this House. And again, by contrast, only this week, Christine Graham, MSP, introduced a bill to the Scottish Parliament to tackle unlicensed puppy farming, establishing a code of practice for the buying and selling of dogs in Scotland. Meanwhile, in Scotland, we are forced to twiddle our thumbs, waiting for this government to implement its own measures on puppy farming. Little of this, of course, of the stuff I've just said, you won't read any of this in the media, but the Scottish Government is absolutely committed to the highest animal welfare standards, indeed exceeding EU regulations. The UK Government compares very poorly with the excellent work being done in Scotland. But where we are reliant in Scotland on the UK Government in reserved areas, we are held back. But, of course, this extends way beyond animal welfare, but I won't go into that, Mr Speaker. I recall, Mr Deputy Speaker, during the Brexit campaign, the nonsense we were told about how Brexit would allow improved animal welfare standards, even outstripping the EU, because we would be liberated to move at a faster pace of improvement. But this government can't even move beyond the wit of its own backbenchers. It's terrified of its own members. Exactly. The former DEFRA Secretary of State, the Honourable Member for Camborne and Redruth, of course, was right. Everybody in this room knows that he was right. The way we treat animals, in particular farmed animals, is a hallmark of a civilised society. Everyone who is watching can see what dropping this bill tells us about this government, and what we can conclude about how civilised it is when we compare and contrast it with the record of the Scottish Government on animal welfare. Dropping this bill was a significant moment in our progress towards improving animal welfare across the UK, and dropping it is out of step with what we know our constituents want and what we know is right. That is why I would support any motion to have the provisions of this original bill passed through this House. Dropping this bill, Mr Deputy Speaker, shows this is a government in retreat. It is out of ideas, it has lost any semblance of moral authority, it has a Prime Minister who is afraid to proceed with his own legislation, despite it being in his manifesto, for fear of upsetting some of his notable backbenchers. This government is a shrinking, lily-livered, weak-kneed, base husk of a shell of a government which has lost its way, it has lost its purpose, and dropping this bill is symptomatic of that. Animal welfare will pay the price. To tell this House that this bill has been ditched, but the government will bring forward individual provisions covering what was in the bill, simply does not ring true. Quite frankly, Mr Deputy Speaker, it's a lot of nonsense. We need to ensure that the important provisions in the original bill, which the government is too preoccupied and too cowardly to proceed with themselves, are allowed to progress through this House, and that is why we in the SNP support this motion. Yeah.